Hi, and welcome to today's version 1 fireside chat on the latest updates to Windows Server licensing. My name is Carla Doherty, I'm Principal Licensing Consultant here at version 1, and I'm joined alongside by my fellow Principal Microsoft Licensing Consultant, Niamh Ní Súilleabháin. How are you, Niamh?
I'm good today, Carl. Thanks.
Good, good. So, Microsoft Windows Server, few updates in the last few weeks. Um, as of the 1st of October, the world has changed on in the world of Microsoft Windows Server licensing. I suppose before we get into the detail, probably makes sense to have a very quick recap in terms of what was the world like before the 1st of October 2020 from a Windows Server licensing perspective, and particularly on virtual machines, right? So in the past, when it came to licensing Windows Server, organizations had two modes of licensing in a way. One for large scale virtualization, one for small scale virtualization. Large scale virtualization, we typically saw organizations license with Windows Server Data Center at the physical core level. Once you license the appropriate number of cores, a minimum of 16 on a physical host, it was in effect an all you can eat buffet, and you could run as many virtual instances of Windows Server as was technically possible on that physical host.
Yeah.
Second scenario was where we had Windows Server and there was small scale virtualization. So this is where you might have had, two, four, or six VMs on a standalone host, or you might have had two or four VMs on a host that might have also been using a certain level of dynamic movement. So the VMs would have been moving between those physical hosts within a 90-day period. Um, and that was typically how organizations licensed Windows Server. Oh, sorry, I should have said for the small scale virtualization organizations would have applied in a Windows Server standard license, depending on the number of cores that they had to license. Minimum of 16, of course, came into play. They were provided rights for two VMs for each set of licenses that they correctly applied. So what we saw in the past was this whole kind of concept of stacking Windows Server licenses on top of each other, where you had small scale virtualization requirements. Now that created some complexity because then you had to work out, how many licenses did you need relative to the number of VMs, the number of cores in the machine, and then, if you were making use of dynamic movement and the machines were moving between hosts within a 90-day period, you then had to also look at, okay, do I need to license those separate hosts for that, for that eventuality that they will move between ESX1 or a Hyper-V 1 and 2 server within 90 days. So, as what in theory should be kind of fairly simple way of licensing can actually become quite complicated and convoluted for
Cumbersome. Yeah.
cumbersome. Yeah, exactly. When licensing Windows Server standard for small scale virtualization. So fast forward to the 1st of October 2022, and Microsoft have introduced this new licensing metric around, or should I say licensing metrics around Windows Server standard. And now we're starting to see this shift away from being able to license solely at the physical core level to being able to license the actual Windows Server VMs on an individual basis. So there's a couple of caveats here, right? So each Windows Server VM requires, if I remember the rules off the top of my head, 8 cores per VM
Minimum. Yeah.
minimum, yeah. And then customers are required to hold 16 core licenses. So my interpretation of that is that once you buy 16 core licenses, then you've got, you can go off and add on top of that. But my assumption here is that with, if you've got just one VM and you wanted to apply the 8 cores to that one VM, you'd still have to buy the 16. So you've got to, the starting point is you still have to buy 16 core licenses, which isn't too dissimilar from how you would have had that minimum license requirement in the old way of licensing. And then of course you can stack licenses on top of each other, right? So, if you've got that 16 minimum achieved, that will give you the rights to um, two VMs with 8 cores. And then if you need to add on top of that, you can add additional 8 core licenses or 8 cores at a time or whatever that number of cores that you require. But again, the minimum being 8 core licenses. There's a couple of little caveats in this licensing change as well, right? So you need to have active software assurance. So if you're not familiar with software assurance, it's Microsoft support and maintenance program. if you don't have software assurance, then this licensing flexibility doesn't apply. Also worth calling out as well, another health warning or caveat is that any client access licenses that may connect to these virtual machines, they also need to be covered with software assurance as well.
Any users, yeah.
Exactly. What's really interesting about this, and I know you're going to talk a little bit about, some of the impacts of these changes, Neve, but like one of the things I really like about this now is that this licensing change also includes the ability to reassign those Windows Server VMs within the same server farm as frequently as required. And that was a real gotcha in the past when it came to applying Windows Server standard licenses for small scale virtualization, because you almost in certain cases actually had to stack licenses on top of each other and duplicate those licenses for a second or a third set of physical hosts to provide the right licensing entitlement for that eventuality where the VMs may move between multiple physical hosts within a 90-day period. So that's all gone now with this new licensing change. When licensing the individual VMs, you in effect have that ability to move those licenses around the same server farm and not worry about being outside of Microsoft's licensing compliance terms. Again, key caveat here is that the licenses must have active software assurance.
Right.
And kind of taking it further afield than that, if you're an organization and you want to bring these licenses to a third party outsourcer, or what Microsoft refer to as an authorized outsourcer, you now also have the ability to bring these Windows Server licenses to an authorized outsourcer's environment and deploy those licenses on shared servers. And that's a big, big change. Worth calling out a couple of things on that, right? That authorized outsources doesn't include AWS, Google, and Alibaba. In effect, it
Right.
includes everybody else but those three, which Microsoft refer to as listed providers. But if you're using a third party cloud provider outside of the listed providers like AWS, Alibaba, Google, you now have the ability to bring your own Windows Server licenses where you're deploying Windows Server VMs on shared servers, which is a big change. That there was never that ability to do that
Massive.
in the past. Yeah, and I think the overarching terminology on this is what Microsoft call their new flexible virtualization benefit. And we've recorded a fireside chat on this particular topic, and one of our colleagues, William, is pushing out a blog on it, which will give you a little bit more insights around what that benefit means. It doesn't just apply to Windows Server; it also applies to broadly all Microsoft on-premise products. So it's a massive step change in licensing when using an outsourcer, which could benefit quite a lot of organizations. So quite a lot of change in there, right? I would say change for the better, which is always good. I know, Neve, you've done quite a lot of
Yeah.
working with customers to kind of help them right size and optimize how they're licensing Windows servers within, large and small data center environments. And I know
Yeah.
you in particular really like this licensing change because you can actually see firsthand, what's the impact going to be on our customers.
I guess just one example that a lot of customers might have is if they have, let's say, an on-prem, VDI environment, right, where the vast majority of virtualization would be, Windows client, and that's fine. But you often find that there's like, a handful of management servers required that are Windows, server VMs. So often, like, that going back to what you said, like in kind of let's say a cluster of a large kind of VDI on-prem environment with only, let's say for example, like 20 hosts, and you only have maybe 6 VMs, server VMs across that, 20 host environment. All those rules, that the old rules that you alluded to in terms of how to implement controls in limiting the number of hosts, that had the capability of guesting those Windows Server VMs, exactly that, then what's the high watermark of the number of VMs that a host that you've assigned for virtualization at any one time it went on, and customers had to put a lot of work into making sure that they had the correct level of licensing according to how their environment was configured, for Microsoft Server virtualization. And so with these new with the new additional licensing model by virtual CPU or by virtual machine, like I've taken a few kind of working examples across a couple of customers, and the difference in terms of the license consumption side of it is, up to 80%. Lower level of license consumption versus the old rules, and that all, again, down to just taking whatever the vCPU count is for the VM, by the number of VMs that you have, and like that, because you effectively get the same, license mobility across server farms,
Yeah.
benefit that you would for SQL Server and so on. It's fantastic. Like, you don't have to look at restricting, the number of physical hosts within a clustered, kind of environment. So yeah, it's really significant, and that's going to have a big impact, I'd imagine, for customers that are looking at renewal as well, and where this benefit like would have, maximum impact and positive impact from that point of view.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of double bubble in a way, right? So there's obviously, potentially, depending on how you're using Windows Server, a great cost saving opportunity on renewal. So, anybody who's approaching the end of a Microsoft Enterprise Agreement, or if you're purchasing software assurance through some other mechanism for Windows Server, it's definitely worth having a look see, and evaluating what your Windows Server licensing position is, because chances are, if you're licensing Windows Server Standard Edition within your small scale virtualized environments, then there's a great cost saving here. But I think that the other good thing about it is, and as you see with a lot of organizations, is that when it came to managing the license compliance for Windows Server Standard, when you did this stacking of licenses on top of each other, it's notoriously tricky to stay on top of, and over time, unless you're reviewing the position on a quarterly or 6 monthly basis,
Yeah.
you're always going to see a certain level of creep here. So this is, I think this is a great way now of kind of leveling the playing field and eliminating any, potential risks of non-compliance that might lay hidden within your Windows Server licensing estate.
Yeah, I guess, and the good point actually. The flip side is then that the governance becomes about making sure, the number of VMs that you have within kind of a lightly, virtualized kind of environment, that the vCPU counts don't get increased beyond what you have license for, or maybe do you keep a certain buffer of standard licenses for, kind of like you said, any sort of kind of change that gets implemented in those environments, like be it the number of VMs, or a need to increase the vCPU count on certain VMs and so on, because I do see that actually there are certain applications that would have a higher consumption from a vCPU point of view. So it is. So it's new licensing that has positive impacts, and then kind of new governance as well that's required.
Very good. So I think that about wraps up kind of a quick summary of what those key licensing changes are for Windows Server, that were announced in October. We're going to push out a blog that will cover off the various different points that we raised in today's fireside chat. As I mentioned, if you have any burning Microsoft licensing questions, or any other software vendor licensing questions for that matter, do feel free to reach out to the software asset management practice here at Version 1. In particular, if today's fireside chat has broadened your horizons, or maybe it's made things even a little bit more complicated, hopefully not. But if you've got any questions around what these licensing changes might mean to your organization, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be delighted to have a chat about, what's your Windows Server licensing posture right now. And no doubt there's some interesting insights that we could possibly bring to the table, and help you, as we've said a number of times on today's session, reduce cost and prevent any risk of non-compliance. So until the next session, we will see you then. Thanks for attending.